Hello, welcome to Chapter 10. As with Chapter 9, we're continuing our conversation about content. So that is what's the story about? And here we're getting at both the implicit and explicit meaning. So the explicit meaning is what's it really about on the surface? What's the obvious storyline and what's the obvious theme? Implicit messages are those that are more hidden beneath the surface. And so when we're talking especially about women in cinema and African Americans in cinema, it's really important that we're looking for that implicit meaning, the meanings that are hidden or our cultural assumptions and biases that are hidden in films that we don't always notice. So that's what we're paying attention to this week. So one of the things that the chapter starts off reminding you of, as with the last chapter, is so why are we talking about the way power works in society in a book about film? And the truth is that cinema is a powerful tool that helps maintain hegemony, which means the power structures that are in place. So, because cinema is such a popular form of entertainment, it has mass appeal and also mass influence on what happens and what we think. Even again, because of those implicit messages, even when we don't realize it, we are so very influenced by what we see in film. And of course, that connects directly with what we think about people around us. And so, in this chapter, there's a big emphasis on the fact that representation matters. Who do we see in films? Who's making those films? And then what are the biases and assumptions that are rolled in depending on who's at the helm of the production? So, of course, it's no surprise to you that for much of cinematic history, it has not been people of color in charge of filmmaking or in front of the camera. It's mostly been white men. And so that lack of representation is part of what matters as well. Who you don't see on screen is just as important sometimes as who you do. What we have seen over the history of cinema is that with white folks in charge most of the time of making decisions about who we see in front of the camera, we have gotten quite a few stereotypes. And those stereotypes date back to the early days of film. Actually, they date back to before the early days of film. They actually come out of theater. So there's a little plug for why you should study theater too. But in this case, what we see is that cinema actually really helped popularize these stereotypes. And I would argue they're all still with us today. So if you think about contemporary films that you know, you've probably seen some of these stereotypes again. And the book's going to give some definitions of each of these and some examples, so you'll know what to look out for. You'll also then think, are there some new stereotypes that have crept in to cinema in the last few years? This chapter, kind of like chapter 9, also wants to remind you that there have been times that, like we saw, there were women who'd been really instrumental in the early days of filmmaking. There have also been African Americans who've been instrumental to the film industry. And what is interesting in this case is the way cultural appropriation has worked. So, what we see in the early days of films, of film history, is what came to be called as race films. These were films made by Black filmmakers for Black audiences. And so, of course, they moved away from the stereotypes that had become popular in Hollywood cinema to try to portray a more accurate representation of what Black people are actually like instead of what white people think Black people are like. And so those race films were really an important moment in the history of film for African Americans to have their own cinema. And then when Hollywood figured out that those films were profitable, they took them over, they put white folks in charge, and not surprisingly, the stereotypes crept right back in. The same thing happened a little bit later in the 70s with a film genre called Black exploitation. Again, those early Black exploitation films were made by Black filmmakers for Black audiences and were meant to be empowering. But once again, Hollywood saw, hey, here's another way for us to make money. They took over that genre, put white filmmakers in charge, continued using Black actors, but again, continued at that point to reinforce negative stereotypes. So we see this push and pull here of the way that Black filmmakers assert themselves and seek out their audience and gain some financial success. And then Hollywood appropriates that genre, takes it over, and makes the money for themselves. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about in this chapter is what about today? So I want you to think about what has changed. We certainly have more African American filmmakers behind the camera than we did at some other points in film history. And are we seeing new trends? Are we seeing changes? Are we seeing challenges to stereotypes that we might not have seen before? So, one of the things I want you just to have on your radar as you continue watching films is, do you see stereotypes or do you see challenges to stereotypes? Does putting an African American filmmaker behind the camera offer us a more authentic understanding of Black life than perhaps a white filmmaker might be able to do? So that's your introduction to chapter 10. I really hope you enjoy it. It's the last chapter in our book, so you also have something to celebrate there.